And we're in the book of Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah was a Jew who was in service to the Persian government. He was acting as the cupbearer to Artaxerxes, King Xerxes' son, from what they say. And he was in Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire at the time when the Israelites, or some of the Israelites, had returned to Jerusalem with Ezra. Worth noting is that the books of Ezra and Nehemiah apparently were one long book before they were cut up into two separate books. So have that in mind and know that it's sort of the same timeline. Now, Nehemiah wasn't a prophet or a priest. He actually was just an official. So maybe he had some military training or something. I don't know. But he definitely was a man of prayer. And in addition to learning about God from this book, I'm actually going to be learning tips or garnering tips for effective prayer from the 12 recorded prayers that Nehemiah prayed in this book. I've already started from chapter 1 to like glean some things about his prayer life, and I think it might be something that might be worth, of interest to you or worth doing for you as well. Now, his prayer in chapter 1 clearly opened the door for the Israelites to return to Jerusalem and to get the opportunity to rebuild the wall. Not only did God grant him favor with the king, who permitted him to take time off work, and apparently this time that he took off work was 12 years. Yes, 12 whole years. Talk about favor. But then the king didn't just give him 12 years off. He gave him approval, gave him an approval letter, and gave him supplies and security and everything that he needed, escort as well, to take him back to Jerusalem. And God was no doubt in this whole thing, because it was God who put the desire in his heart. And it says so in verse 12. And what he started, he sustained and he completed. Nehemiah and the Jews faced opposition, just like their fellow countrymen, Zerubbabel and Joshua, when they went back to try to rebuild the temple. So in rebuilding the walls, the governors of the surrounding towns weren't very happy at the fact that Jerusalem's walls were being rebuilt. And not only that it was being rebuilt, it was being rebuilt on the order of the king and with support from the king. Obviously, that didn't sit right with their enemies. And the anger of their enemies were Sanballat and Tobiah. And their anger was most likely as a result of like envy. That's what I thought, because I couldn't get it. But then I concluded that it probably was the envy of the Israelites, obviously because of the backing and the favor that they had. And then also maybe because of their dedication and their commitment to rebuilding the city. Now, Nehemiah and the people prayed that God would turn the insults of their enemies back at them, and ignored the taunts of their enemies and just kept on working. The enemies were trying to discourage them, but then they just kept on working, and that actually caused the enemies to attack them. Now, I took this literally. I just imagined this in life. Imagine going through something and having enemies and people taunting you. Your first reaction, or I'll speak for myself, is to be distracted and turn and be like, why are you even bothering me? What is this? And it turns, but then that was the strategy. Obviously, the enemies were trying to distract them, but they just kept being focused. And the fact that they were focused made the enemies attack them. So it got them mad and even got them, So sometimes even ignoring your enemies means that, or forces them to attack you just to get your attention. But God was there in the situation, and Nehemiah prayed. But he didn't just pray and fold his hands. He prayed and then he set up systems of defense, putting men at the wall. And remember that they were working with one hand with their implements and another hand on the sword. So he prayed, but then he also did what he needed to do to defend himself. But God came through for them, and God, fought for them. I love how he prayed, about seemingly everything. Nehemiah just prayed. That's what I saw. He just prayed about everything. But then he also took actions, and measures after praying. Very, 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 very valid points. Right. Now, the irony of the attack of the enemy was that there was an attack imminent, but they didn't even have walls. Because normally your walls will be what will protect you from the enemy, but they didn't have walls and they had an attack that was coming, but they didn't stop. They just kept building with one hand on the building the wall, and another hand with their weapons. So if it's time for war, they were ready to fight. But God came through for them and worked on their behalf and protected them. The people were potentially going down the same route as their ancestors. From what we understood there, they were oppressing the poor and enslaving their fellow citizens due to the famine. But Nehemiah stepped in and made things right. Unlike the pre-exile leaders, because remember the leaders in the pre-exile joined them. In fact, I think they were the ones who started it and the people went that way. But Nehemiah obviously is a leader with a difference. He wasn't a prophet. He wasn't a leader. I mean, he wasn't a priest, but he was like a man who knew, and I think that's what's important sometimes, just people who know God and know what to do. And that's what he did. He actually just stepped in and even did some prophetic act. He was a very focused guy and did all he did for the people, for God's approval and his blessing. Now, here's what I learned about God. God protects his people when their enemies attack them. He did it before and many times in the past, as we've seen in some of the past stories. But in this instance, he did it in a very non-dramatic way, quite subtly, if you noticed, because he just said God just dealt with their opposition, while they focused on the work that they were doing. Prayer helps us to stay up to date with God's plan and understand our roles and stay focused. Sometimes we may need to be active, and other times we need to be passive. But he always works out his plans, sometimes in a ground way and sometimes in a subtle way. So at the end of the day, just pray and trust God. The end. See you here tomorrow, God willing. Thank you for joining me today. We'll continue with the book of Nehemiah tomorrow. God bless you.